Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Nikki had not meant for the day to spiral the way it did, nor had she imagined that a single truth, one she had locked inside her chest like a relic too dangerous to touch, could unravel so much so quickly. But as she stood in the dim light of the study at the Newman Ranch, fingers trembling around the condensation of her neglected glass of sparkling water, she sensed that the moment she opened her mouth to speak, when she let that long-buried confession rise like an exhalation too heavy to hold, everything she had tried for decades to keep steady would tilt irreversibly. Victor watched her with the stillness of a man who had weathered countless storms, yet the mild narrowing of his dark eyes told her he could tell she was not stalling. No, she was bracing, as though the words were a force that might knock her into him or away from him forever, and the quiet between them hummed with the weight of unasked questions. She told herself to breathe, but her lungs felt uncooperative. Then she finally said Victor's name, soft at first, softer than she expected, as though the truth came wrapped in shame, and he stepped closer, urging gently, "What is it, Nikki?" A question laced with the kind of suspicion born only from too many years of watching the woman he loved carry burdens with a poised smile. She opened her mouth but no sound came, so she closed it, swallowed, tried again. And this time the sentence escaped before she could measure or temper it. She had known about the deal Jack made months earlier, known it before Victor ever caught wind of it, known it and kept it from him because she feared how he would react, feared the spiraling consequences that would ripple through all their lives, and the feeling of betraying Jack, a man who had once given her refuge in darker days, made her hesitate to expose him, though she knew, deep down, that the obligation to honesty with her husband ultimately outweighed the ghosts of old loyalties. Victor stood perfectly still, not a muscle betraying emotion, yet the silence throbbed with the unmistakable sense that a fuse had been lit. Nikki rushed to explain that it had never been Jack's intention to hurt Victor, that the deal had been a desperate attempt to shield Jabot during a moment of corporate vulnerability, and that she had heard indirectly, almost accidentally, but once she knew she felt cornered by the truth. Torn between two men whose history was soaked with rivalry, betrayal, and fleeting moments of uneasy truce, Victor stepped back slowly, the movement so controlled it frightened her more than an outburst ever could, and he asked why she had not come to him the moment she learned of it. The question sliced through her with precision because she had no answer that would soothe him, only a collection of tangled explanations that sounded hollow even to her own ears. She tried to speak but her voice wavered, and Victor, sensing the confession was larger than what she had already shared, demanded the entire truth. In that moment Nikki realized that withholding even a fragment now would only deepen the damage, so she confessed that the deal Jack orchestrated had involved not just an attempt to shore up Jabot's finances but had skirted dangerously close to territory that could have implicated Victor himself, territory involving a vendor contract Victor once terminated for unethical practices, which Jack had quietly revived through a shell intermediary. She had not known the full scope at first, but when she pieced it together she panicked, believing that telling Victor too early would provoke a war that might engulf not just the two men, but their families as well, and so she held her silence, hoping the situation would resolve quietly on its own, but instead it grew heavier with every passing day until it became a secret big enough to bend her posture. Victor's jaw tightened with a simmering fury held barely in check, and he turned away from her, pacing with the slow deliberation of a man trying to keep his temper bridled by sheer will. He told her that Jack had crossed a line, that this was more than a business slight or a petty attempt to undermine him. This was a calculated move with teeth, a deceptive maneuver that danced dangerously close to illegality, and the realization that Nikki had carried this knowledge alone, letting Victor operate in the dark while Jack hovered so near their orbit, made him feel exposed and betrayed. Nikki whispered that she was sorry, sorrier than she had ever been, and Victor paused, his back still to her, then ordered her to tell him every detail, leaving nothing out. She complied, recounting how Jack had expressed doubts to her in passing conversation, how he had been torn between his desire to protect his family legacy and his fear that Victor would crush him if he sensed weakness at Jabot, and how Jack believed he had found a loophole, a technical but risky strategy, that could buy him time. Nikki explained she had tried to urge Jack to reconsider without revealing she knew the depth of his strategy, and that she believed he had listened, but now she realized he had simply gone quiet, internalizing the pressure until it festered. When Nikki finished, Victor stared at her with a complex hurt in his eyes, one that blended betrayal, disappointment, and undeniable love, but he said nothing as he left the study, telling her only that he needed air. Nikki sank onto the sofa, shaken, knowing that this would not end with Victor's silent exit and suspecting that Jack, who had already been showing signs of strain under the weight of his secret dealings, would be the next domino to fall. Victor's fury was not a gentle tide but a crashing wave, and though he tried to contain it, his instincts drove him straight to Jack, who at that very moment had been standing in his office at Jabot staring blankly at spreadsheets he could no longer focus on, feeling the pressure like a vice around his temples. When Victor barged in, Jack nearly dropped the pen he'd been holding, and he attempted to gather himself, smoothing his expression into something neutral, but one look into Victor's burning eyes told him the truth had surfaced. Victor did not bother with preamble, he accused Jack outright, listing each detail Nikki had confessed, and Jack felt the room tilt, his lungs constricting with the sudden collapse of the carefully balanced facade he had maintained for months. He stammered a defense at first, claiming he had not meant for things to escalate, that the vendor contract had been resurrected merely as a temporary measure, but the words sounded feeble. Even to him, dissolving under the heat of Victor's rage, Victor moved closer, telling Jack that his actions had put everyone in jeopardy, that his maneuvering was not just underhanded but reckless, and that if Nikki had not come forward. Finally, he emphasized, Jack might have pushed himself into a corner with no escape. The mention of Nikki made Jack blanch, because he had not realized she had been the one to tell Victor, and a fresh swell of guilt flooded him, mixing with a deeper fear, that Nikki, who had once been his sanctuary, had felt forced to expose him. Jack's composure began to buckle as he tried to respond, his breath quickening in shallow bursts. He insisted he never wanted Nikki involved, never wanted her hurt. Never wanted Victor dragged into the gray ethics of Jabot's crisis management, and he kept repeating the word never until it sounded like a plea. Victor, seeing Jack's unraveling, paused, not out of mercy, but out of shock, because Jack Abbott, perpetual combatant, king of corporate counterstrikes, stood before him visibly shaking, eyes unfocused, fingers gripping the edge of his desk as though anchoring himself to keep from falling. Jack tried to continue explaining, but the narrative in his head disintegrated into fragments, and he felt the walls pressing in, felt the oxygen thinning, felt memories of past failures and past humiliations colliding with present panic. Nikki had feared this very outcome, that revealing the truth to Victor would ignite consequences Jack was too brittle to withstand. Victor stepped back slightly, realizing that Jack was no longer processing his accusations but battling something internal, something frayed and raw. Jack's voice cracked as he said he had only wanted to protect his family, to prove he could handle the weight of Jabot without crashing under its legacy, and that every time he tried to rise above his mistakes, something, sometimes himself, sometimes fate, sometimes Victor, pulled him back down. Victor, though still furious, felt a conflicting tug of empathy, because he recognized the look in Jack's eyes, had seen it in soldiers, in corporate rivals, in men pushed past their limits, a man at the brink of a breakdown. Jack sank into his chair, hands trembling uncontrollably, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak, his breath shallow and rapid. Victor wanted to demand answers, wanted to unleash the full force of his anger, but even he knew that doing so might shatter Jack entirely. Jack whispered Nikki's name, almost inaudibly, and Victor stiffened, asking what she had to do with this beyond revealing the secret. Jack shook his head, saying he never wanted her burdened, never wanted her caught between them and the guilt of knowing she had chosen honesty with Victor weighed heavily, too heavily, on him. He admitted that he had been spiraling for weeks, waking in the middle of the night with his heart pounding, struggling to focus at work, drinking more than he should, convinced that one wrong move could destroy Jabot forever. The admission came out in bursts, as though the dam had finally cracked, and Jack's voice wavered with an exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. Victor listened, still angry but increasingly aware that this moment was no longer about corporate warfare. It was about two men entwined by decades of rivalry, pushing and pulling until something finally gave. Jack's head fell into his hands, shoulders shaking, and Victor, though conflicted, called for someone to get Jack water, then stayed silently in the room, pacing near the window, trying to reconcile the fury inside him with the human collapse happening before him. Jack muttered that he hated himself for putting Nikki in such a position, hated himself for hiding the truth, hated that he had let fear of failing his family, fear of being seen as weak, guide him into a decision that had now cost him everything: his stability, his pride, and the thin thread of trust he had maintained with people he cared for. Victor folded his arms, finally speaking in a calmer, lower tone, telling Jack that while he would answer for what he did, the first priority was for him to get himself under control. Jack laughed weakly through the remnants of his panic, saying control was the one thing he had lost entirely. After several minutes, when Jack's breathing slowed and he wiped the sweat from his forehead with a shaky hand, Victor said something neither man expected: "You should have come to me yourself." The honesty of the statement startled Jack, who muttered that he feared Victor would use the information as a weapon. Victor did not deny that possibility, but he added that at least Jack would not be drowning alone beneath the consequences. The words, though blunt, carried an unexpected weight of reluctant truth, and Jack looked up at Victor with a mixture of disbelief and painful gratitude, because the rivalry between them had always been volatile, yet beneath it lay a strange, begrudging respect. In the doorway, Nikki appeared, having followed Victor after realizing he had stormed out of the ranch, and when she saw Jack's condition her heart clenched with a heavy mixture of regret and sorrow. Jack's eyes met hers and she tried to convey, with a single expression, that she had not meant for this to happen, that she had only wanted to prevent greater devastation, but Jack turned away, unable to face her yet. Nikki stepped inside cautiously, speaking softly, telling Jack she was sorry, telling him she never imagined her confession would crack him open like this, and Jack whispered that he supposed the truth had been waiting to break him, and she had simply been the one brave enough to let it out. Victor watched them both with an unreadable expression, feeling the complex web of old wounds, entanglements, loyalties, and rivalries knitting and tearing simultaneously before his eyes. Nikki moved toward Jack, placing a light hand on his shoulder, and he did not flinch this time, though his posture remained fragile, like something rebuilt too quickly. She told him he was stronger than he believed, that secrecy had become his enemy long before she had spoken a word. Jack nodded faintly, knowing she was right but still grappling with the aftermath. Victor, still simmering with unresolved anger, nonetheless said they would deal with the business fallout later, when Jack was lucid and steady, and that for now Jack needed to rest, to step away from the battlefield before he destroyed himself on it. Jack looked at Victor with a mixture of shock and wary appreciation, then whispered thank you. Though his voice barely carried, Nikki exhaled shakily, sensing the fragile truce forming in the room, a truce born not from forgiveness but from necessity, and she silently vowed to help both men navigate the wreckage she had inadvertently unleashed. Victor placed a firm hand on the back of Jack's chair, steadying it as if symbolically steadying the man in it, and for a flicker of a moment the years of animosity between them softened, only a fraction, but enough to shift the air. Jack, eyes still glassy, finally admitted that he had been crumbling long before the secret surfaced, and that perhaps this breakdown, though humiliating, was the only thing strong enough to force him to confront the truth about himself. Nikki squeezed his shoulder, Victor stepped back with a heavy exhale, and Jack, for the first time in months, allowed himself to breathe fully, knowing that while the consequences of his actions were far from over, he no longer had to pretend, no longer had to hold the world up alone, no longer had to cling to a facade that was breaking him from the inside. And as all three stood together in that tense, quiet office, bound by truth, betrayal, and the unexpected vulnerability that had emerged from the chaos, they each realized that the moment Nikki revealed her secret had not just exposed what Jack had done, but had exposed them all to the raw, unfiltered reality of the tangled bond they shared, a bond too complicated for forgiveness, too painful for distance, yet too human to sever, leaving them suspended in a fragile, uncertain peace that none of them fully understood, but all of them desperately needed. In the long, suspended silence that followed, as the three of them stood anchored in that strange, fragile truce, Nikki realized that the shock of Jack's breakdown had not merely shaken him, it had shaken Victor too, forcing him to confront a truth he often buried beneath confidence and control, that even the fiercest rivalries were forged between human beings, not impenetrable titans, and that decades of conflict left behind scars that did not simply vanish when the battle quieted. Victor's gaze drifted toward the window, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the office floor, and he felt a dull ache at the memory of every moment his rivalry with Jack had teetered on the line between corporate warfare and personal destruction, as though the two men had unknowingly spent half their lives dragging each other through the wreckage of ambitions that never seemed fully satisfied. Meanwhile, Jack wiped his eyes with the back of his trembling hand, aware that the mask he had worn for months, perhaps years, had shattered in front of the two people who could wound him most deeply, and part of him wondered whether the collapse had been inevitable from the start, a slow-motion fall masked as resilience. Nikki stepped back slightly to give him room, though every instinct in her urged her to stay close, not out of guilt but out of a quiet understanding that human frailty, once exposed, needed gentleness, not distance. She looked at Victor, hoping to read some sign of how he intended to proceed, but Victor's expression remained impenetrable, as though he were mentally sorting through years' worth of tangled emotions, watching each thread unravel in the wake of the secret she had revealed. Jack, noticing the tension humming beneath Victor's stillness, forced himself to breathe steadily, afraid that any flicker of panic might reignite the storm that had momentarily calmed. He whispered that he didn't expect forgiveness, didn't deserve it, perhaps, but needed them to. No, he had not acted out of malice, only fear, and that those fears had grown until they cast shadows over every decision he made. Victor exhaled slowly, his jaw flexing, and he told Jack in a low, measured voice that intention did not erase consequences, but that even he, Victor Newman, man of iron reputation, understood what fear could make someone do. The admission surprised Nikki, whose eyes flicked toward her husband, seeing in him a depth of vulnerability rarely shown, and she felt a piercing gratitude that even in his anger, he had chosen not to strike when Jack was already bowed. But Victor, ever the strategist, was already calculating the next steps, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, for the mess Jack had made would not vanish simply because the truth had been spoken. He told Jack that if the vendor contract Jack had resurrected still had any active threads connecting it to Newman Enterprises, they needed to sever them immediately to avoid any implication that Victor had played a role, knowingly or unknowingly, in reviving a tainted partnership. Jack nodded, wiping his forehead again, saying he had already begun the process of dissolving the contract but had not completed it, and that there were still lingering documents and financial ties to unwind. Victor's nostrils flared subtly, frustrated but not surprised, and he told Jack that he would help, only to expedite the cleanup and protect their respective companies from fallout, not because he excused Jack's actions. The statement, though stern, struck Jack with unexpected relief, and he nodded vigorously, saying he would forward every document, every email, every record within the hour. Nikki, sensing a shift toward problem-solving, stepped forward and reminded both men that business could wait until Jack steadied himself fully, but Jack shook his head, insisting that taking action, reclaiming even a shred of control, was the only thing that would keep him from spiraling again. Victor studied him for a moment, then agreed, albeit reluctantly, telling Jack that he expected full cooperation and full transparency, nothing less. Jack accepted this without protest, feeling a weight lift slightly from his chest simply because the path forward, though daunting, no longer felt like a labyrinth he had to navigate alone. Nikki moved closer to Jack again, placing a hand over his for a brief moment. An unspoken gesture of comfort that acknowledged their complicated history while reaffirming the fragile peace among them, and Jack looked up at her with a mixture of gratitude and remorse, saying softly that he never wanted her caught in the crossfire of his worst decisions. Nikki assured him that she understood, that secrets could twist even the strongest people into knots, and that she wished she had found a way to help without bearing the burden so privately, but she also acknowledged that telling Victor had been necessary, even if the fallout had been painful. Jack nodded, gripping the armrests of his chair as his breathing returned to something closer to normal. Though his body still trembled with the aftershocks of the breakdown, Victor stepped toward the door, signaling the end of the immediate confrontation, but he paused when he realized Jack had not risen from his seat, and with an almost imperceptible softening in his voice, he told Jack to take the rest of the day, no, the week, off if needed, because navigating the mess with a fractured mindset would only compound the damage. Jack blinked in surprise, not expecting Victor Newman of all people to prioritize his well-being, but after a moment he managed to whisper that maybe he would, though he wasn't sure how to step away from the chaos without feeling like everything would collapse in his absence. Nikki assured him that the world would not fall apart if he took a breath, and Victor, with equal firmness, said that even if it tried to, they would manage it, together or separately, but manage it nonetheless. Jack nodded again, swallowing hard as his throat tightened with the emotion he fought to control, and he whispered that he didn't know what came next, only that he was tired of carrying so much alone. Nikki smiled gently, telling him that acknowledging that truth was the first step toward healing, and Victor, though less poetic, added that facing consequences was easier than running from them, a sentiment that resonated deeply with Jack, who felt a small, unexpected flicker of strength return to him. As the three filed slowly toward the hallway, Jack steadied himself on the edge of his desk before standing, his legs weak but cooperative, and Victor hovered a step behind him as though prepared to catch him if he faltered, though he would never admit such an intention aloud. Nikki walked beside Jack, her presence